remember they used to have, at least used to have, these letter grade things, right? Where an A was doing really well and a B was kind of doing okay. A C was a little below average, a D wasn't so great, and an F was failing. But there's going to be no Fs this morning because I don't think anybody deserves a failing grade on dealing with this. But I do have some thoughts in the A side and the D side with how to deal with this and kind of what's going on. So I'm going to start with the Ds because the Ds are the things that are maybe not so productive. And then I'm going to get to the more productive things you can do. So here's the first D, and this is kind of the big one, and I think you'll all recognize it. And the first big D is denial. Life has changed. There's no gainsaying that. Whatever you think about the science behind what's going on, whatever you think about what's happening with the pandemic or with some of the newly emergent discussion about racial disparity, life has changed dramatically in the past 6 months. And I know we all know this because it's staring us in the face. Actually, you know, it's kind of interesting for me because at Apalachee Center, we're considered essential workers, and we kind of have to be essential workers because folks need mental health treatment no matter whether there's a pandemic or not. So for the most part, I've been continuing to go to work, spending a lot of time on Zoom at work, but there are some disruptions in life that have not hit me personally, but I look around, folks I know, my friends, my family, and for those folks who are not going to work, for those folks who are isolating at home, or even for those folks who are going to work, but going in a mask, coming back in a mask, going to socially distanced grocery stores, maybe not going out other places, life is dramatically different than it was before. Well, here's something that people are just bad at, and we're all bad at it, is accepting when life has changed dramatically in a matter of weeks. We're just not good at that. We can kind of do okay with slow, gradual change, right? But rapid change, unpredictable change, and change that we try to kind of, you know, figure out a way through and then it changes again, because that's what's happened with life recently, right? Is that we kind of think one thing and then we think something else 2 weeks later and we hear something else 2 weeks later and then it all changes again 2 weeks after that. And it's because we're all learning this as we go. But in circumstances like this, it's really easy to fall into denial, to say, you know, nothing's really changed. You know, I don't understand why I can't go to the restaurant, go to the game. I don't understand why I can't be in the group anymore. It's denial. And again, this is independent of political stance or your feelings or thoughts about the pandemic, which, by the way, I do have to just throw this in, have no influence on the pandemic whatsoever, right? How we think about it really has no influence on the course of the disease. But however you think about it, life has changed. That's the reality. That's the bedrock. And so one of the first things that I say is not a helpful way to deal with this is to just be in denial about it, to say, yeah, this isn't really happening. Because where it leads you is to a place where you're not dealing with reality anymore, which is not ideal. So then there's a second D that I want to get into, and it's related to denial, but it's kind of the flip side of it, and it's what I would call disengagement. So disengagement is kind of the other end of the scale, and it says there's a lot of stuff we can't do anymore. There's a lot of stuff we can't do socially live, right? There's gatherings that have been restricted. Even the experience of masking is one that leads to a really interesting kind of disengagement, because right now we look like this, right? So what we're used to as people, and this starts as in infancy, is we're used to figuring out and reading social cues from people's entire faces, not just their eyes. So when all you can see is somebody's eyes, there's a level of uncertainty you have about what's going on with the social engagement that can lead to saying, yeah, this is kind of uncomfortable talking to somebody else with a mask while I'm in a mask. That's kind of uncomfortable. And if you're staying home, if you're sheltering at home, if you're not going out, that leads to sort of a broad-based disintegration or beginning of disintegration of community bonds and honestly, community bonds, and that's friendships, families, church families, work families. That's kind of what keeps us human. And the disintegration of those bonds, if it's not freely chosen, and what I mean by that is that there are folks living monastic lifestyles, there are folks living eremitic lifestyles who've freely chosen a withdrawal from the world. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that there's been an enforced withdrawal from the world. And if you continue to carry that forward, if we carry that forward, we end up weakening and disrupting the bonds of community, which is right now actually what we need. But there's all kinds of things telling us to withdraw, to stay home, to disengage. And ultimately, the problem with both disengagement and denial is that they lead to my big third D here, which is despair. It's community and it's connection both to reality and other people that keep you in a place in the world where you continue to get fed, right? Because emotionally we get fed by a few different things. We get fed, I believe we get fed by God. I believe we get fed by our spiritual faith, and we get fed by our connections and our relationships. And in the absence of those, disengaged, not getting fed by reality, you can end up in despair. And that's the depression and the anhedonia, which just means a loss of pleasure in anything, that we're starting to see more and more of. And I was talking a little bit to Claire and Carol and Mother Abby before folks came on the phone. And one of the things we're talking about is that in the field, our expectation is that we're going to see a surge in mental health crises and mental health issues in November or December, because usually there's about a 6-month swing between the trauma itself and the actual impact of that trauma. That was kind of the received wisdom for a few months since we've seen this, increased surge now. At this point, it's true for so much of this illness, all bets are off. I'm not really sure what's going to happen. But what I can tell you is that once a vaccine is developed, once things open up again in the mental health field, it's not like we've seen the end of it. That may be sort of the beginning of the wave, and that all has to do with long-term despair and depression that kind of erode people's sense of who they are, people's emotional feeding from the community. So those are kind of the big 3 Ds, or denial, disengagement, and despair. But we've actually got some good news on the other side. And the good news is the A's that kind of counter those things. So the first A is acceptance. And I kind of could have called this adjustment, but I'm going to call it acceptance. There is a new, very fluid way of living in the world now. And I say fluid because, as I said, things are changing. Things are changing week by week and day by day. And in working in healthcare, this is, in some respects, I don't know if it's more acute than in other fields, but I certainly get a lot of professional communication about it. And one of the things that's been striking is, as the medical folks and medical researchers learn more about what's going on with the pandemic, things change, right? So initially there was a lot of terror, really, about the transmissibility of COVID through surfaces. And as time goes on, that's diminished somewhat. It's not completely absent, but 2 months ago, 3 months ago, there was a lot of really terror about what would go, my Lord, if these things can live on, if this virus can live on surfaces for 2 weeks, there goes your entire supply chain. Well, turns out it kind of can't, but we didn't know that. So that's changed. At the same time, one of the things we didn't know also was the level of asymptomatic transmissibility. So now we know more about, yeah, this stuff can be, we're probably talking about much higher numbers than we think we are. And I promise not to talk about science here, so I'm gonna switch back to what that means is there's a call for us to accept and adjust to a reality that is going to continue to change. And that's how you get away from denial. Is it's not like you can't long for the day when you can go on a vacation to New England, which is something I was thinking about earlier today. Was I'd really like to be able to see New England in the summer again, and I really can't because I'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks, and I don't have 2 weeks off work that I can go quarantine in. So it's not like you can't long for that, but you have to adjust. We have to adjust to where we actually are now. And even though that feels bad in a way because we're not in a great place, ultimately doing it is way healthier. It's something that keeps you way more connected to reality. So adjustment and acceptance are sort of the first A on this. Second one, and this kind of counters the disengagement, is affiliation. Now, here's the cool thing about affiliation in this venue is everybody on this call is already doing it, right? Because you're coming to church. You're coming to the coffee talk after church. And so this is literally preaching to the choir a little bit, but I would go ahead and continue to preach to the choir and say, keep doing that in every venue that you can. And again, this is something that for me, and in thinking about this discussion this morning, I kind of came to grips with, yeah, I'm going to work every day, and everybody who I'm working with is going to work every day. And so there's a certain breakdown of affiliation that we don't have. But once every couple of weeks, my wife, who comes from a fairly large family, has a Zoom call with her sibs, and I get on that, and the in-laws get on it, and my nephews get on it, and everybody's on the call. And it's a form of maintaining affiliation and relationship. You continue to be connected to things, which gets you away from the disengagement. And that's one, and people complain about this, but I have to throw in a shout out essentially to mediums like Zoom and Teams and Skype and to social media in general. This is remarkable, right? There was a level of isolation and social isolation that folks went through 100 years ago during the Spanish flu pandemic that we just don't have to have. We can keep doing what we're doing right now. We can see people face to face, their whole faces, and we can keep our connections with the people that we're in relationship with. We can maintain affiliation, and we do that through technology. So we're very blessed in a sense to have these capacities to connect that we do now. And I think that's the second A, is that's the thing that kind of counters the disengagement. And the third one, third A, the third kind of, great passing grade is activity. And that's the thing that kind of keeps you away from despair. And activity is a little bit different now, right? Because there are certain activities that we're restricted from. But what I'm talking about is social engagement. Now, not just affiliation with people that you're connected to, but getting involved, getting interested, being part of things that actually can create change in your community and for yourself. Now, I'll give you a perfect example of this for yourself. One of the things when people started staying home that was really hard for people, and it's one of the things that has been really hard for parents homeschooling their kids, is suddenly things are structureless, right? You used to have we all used to have structure to our day that just evaporated for the folks who weren't going to work. And the thing about structure is we can create that for ourselves. If we're not used to doing it, now is the time to get used to doing it. Now is the time to get used to getting up at a certain time, having an exercise routine, a reading routine, a connectedness routine, having things kind of more rigid than they used to be, because there's less reinforcement from outside to do those things now. So the thing about activity is we have to sort of generate it for ourselves. But the cool thing is we're all capable of that. This is nothing we can't do. We just haven't had to do it before. So that's the piece for ourselves is if you're used to a work schedule and you're not working, create a schedule that feels like work. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, if it's gardening, if it's reading, it's allotting certain times of the day to doing things that actively engage you. And then the next step on the activity front has to do with active engagement in the community. And that's something that I think really, really is helpful right now, because again, there's fewer pressures to do it. But I can tell you, there are hundreds of opportunities for community engagement through Zoom, through appropriate social distancing, which I think St. John's is one of the great hubs of those things in this community. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of the connectedness to church and to other community organizations that you're involved in. And you may have been distant before. Get up to your elbows in it now, because in the absence of other things, this is the time to do that. And the magic behind this is that those activities, which in the past may have felt like, hell, I'm going to work and I'm doing this and I'm doing that, this is on top of it. These aren't on top of things anymore. This is to create the structure that allows you to stay kind of sharp and engaged. So those are kind of the 3 A's that I think counter the 3 D's. Those are the things that get you the better grades in this. There's one more thing, and I know that I'm kind of running out of time here, but there's one more thing that okay. One more.
You're fine. Keep going, Jay.
All right, fair enough, Mother Abby. There is one more thing that I did want to say. This is a very tough time for a lot of folks. And one of the things that is kind of remarkable right now that not remotely enough people know about is that over the course of the past couple of years, there have been many, many more resources put into mental health in this community than previously existed. It's been kind of amazing. And, we've tried to put stuff in the paper, but people read it, they don't read it. So one of the things that currently exists, and this is at sort of the more serious end of the spectrum, is about 1.5 years ago, the mobile response team located at Apalachee Center was funded. So what that means is that there's a team of master's level therapists who are on call 24/7, who will pick up the phone, will do phone counseling, will connect you with resources, will come out and talk to you in your home or in the community. And again, 24/7. The number to call is 1-800-342-0774. Now, and once again, that's 1-800-342-0774. And I'll email that to Mother Abby so she can, send it to folks. And she just did. So there you go. It's the magic of modern technology.
So many hands.
That's very impressive. So the cool thing about this number is that it's not limited to folks who are having, sort of Baker Act level life-threatening emergencies. Folks at that level can absolutely call, family members can call, friends can call, and are encouraged to. But you can also call that number if you're just looking to connect with resources for yourself or for someone else. If you need someone to talk to, if you need to be connected to a therapist in the community, you can call that number and talk to a master's level person. You can also call 1-888. Yeah, I'm watching Mother Abby get ready here. 1-888-954-3834. And that's 1-888-954-3834, which is supposed to spell out 1-888-95 get help, but I'm always confused by the actual letters, so I like to, give you the numbers. That is, again, it's a 24/7 resource that is created through Big Bend Community-Based Care, which is our local managing entity, but it's staffed by Apalachee Center. So that actually connects you to the same place that that earlier 1-800 number did. But that's also for the really the entire panhandle to call that number. And then, of course, there's Big Bend, there's a 211 Big Bend, and that's just 211. But the cool thing at 211 Big Bend is that they have employed a couple of mental health specific counselors answering the phone who can also get you to the right resources. We've never had this level of resources, at least in the 15 years I've been here. We've never come close to this before. And a lot of this came out of the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, that there were finally, I shouldn't say that, there were some resources that were put in by the legislature that we hadn't previously had. So people should take advantage of that. We've got folks sitting ready to answer the phone and call. The other piece that I'll throw out there is about 5 years ago, we created something called the Mental Health Council of the Big Bend, which is it's essentially like the industry experts and folks with lived experience who we pulled together to meet regularly to try and advance the conversation about mental health in this region. And we don't have a 1-800 number, but we do have a website, which is mentalhealthcouncil.org. So mentalhealthcouncil, all one word, .org. And that can get you into the mental health resource directory, which is an actively tended resource directory that can show you what therapists are in the community, what insurances they're taking, what hours they have, what their specialties are, how to get in touch with them. So we've got a bunch of ways in for folks who are feeling like they need somebody to talk to, for folks who are worried about somebody else, all the way up to folks who are in an active psychiatric crisis. We've got a lot of ways to connect. So I always like to kind of put that out there to make sure people know about it, because that's the point of these things, is to have them used. So there you go. Those were kind of my thoughts for the day. And like I said, some of this is sort of preaching to the choir, but I think that's sometimes the choir can benefit from, having a little reinforcement of something they're already doing.
Well, and the choir continues to, those resources are extremely helpful. It's affirming to hear how there are struggles, and being able to hear that resonance and seeing that maybe in our own selves and in others. And then also the A's, the affirming affirmations of, okay, that has made me feel good. That's why. So one of the things that struck me, Jay, and I encourage anyone with questions to go ahead and write them in the chat if you have them. We'll try to answer them as we go. So please do put them right there in the chat section. I wanted to say, Jay, I don't know about for you, but for me, there are days where I have a D on one piece and then I have an A in something else. And it goes sometimes, I don't know, hour, minute by minute, and it's a roller coaster in the midst of our four walls. And any thoughts about that? I know it is a common occurrence. I'm not the only person with that sort of roller coaster going on. Any thoughts? It's not just, oh, I'm living in the D's and I'm going to progress to the A's. Can you speak to how that's probably a continuum in most people's lives?
Absolutely. That's an excellent observation. So here's the thing, right? That experience of being on a roller coaster is accurate. That's not something that's being generated internally. We are all on this roller coaster, and literally all over the world, we are all on this roller coaster together. And so part of the recognition of that sense of, okay, I'm engaged, I'm active, I'm doing this, but oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen next. You're absolutely right. So a piece of it is, that's kind of a message from reality. That's not something that's being generated internally. The question really is what you do with that, because the challenge here is that we as people love order. I mean, I do. I love structure. I love routine. Like I really, really love those things. I don't get bored
Checking
by
things
those
off
things.
of lists, right, Jay?
Exactly right. There's, there is no part of me that's ambivalent about that. There's no part of me that's like, oh, I wish I had more adventure. No, I don't. I like to wake up. I like to go running. I like to go to work. Those are the things I like. And so which does really beg the question of why I became a psychologist. But anyway, that's a whole other story.
That's a different sermon.
That is in fact a different circumstance. So so we like that, and we can't have that right now. And the problem with not being able to have that right now is that it creates anxiety. That's right. That's the whole thing. It creates anxiety, and unchecked anxiety leads to depression. That's, that's not even so much psychological as a biological observation. There's the neurochemicals that get released during the experience of anxiety, if they're released frequently enough and without resolution, have a tendency to lead to the same kind of neurochemical changes that create depression. So the way around that, I think, is twofold. It's recognizing that this is reality. Like, we're on that. This is not something you can think your way out of, like, oh, I guess it's not that bad. Yeah, it kind of is. So, but that's okay. Because we are all going through this together, and everyone has different ways of binding anxiety. Whether that, for me, it's exercise. So if I can't exercise, things are very, very hard for me. For other people, it's prayer, it's meditation, it can be connection with family, it can be connection with friends, it can be there's a whole host of things. I think it's probably incumbent on us right now to identify what those things are for us. And again, there's no wrong way to do this, because you'll know, right? You get to be the judge of what makes you less anxious. So once you figure out what that is, prioritize that. And that's the thing you use when the motion of the roller coaster gets to be a little bit much for you. You're using that to keep yourself cool during the experience of this roller coaster ride. So,
and listening to just as much as change keeps occurring, listening to what that affirmation might change and be, listening to the relief it gives, and then also going, well, that's not working right now. So what might the next piece be?
Right.
Dave, you look like you came off mute.
I just wanted to thank Jay so much for being a part of this coffee talk. Jay has been a frequent guest at St. John's, and we're just so grateful for the gift of your time and your wisdom. My question, Jay, is I think a lot of folks, from my perspective, are experiencing grief in this time period. Grief at those things that we've lost, that it just hurts, And so can you help us differentiate between grief, which is a normal human experience, and how one might differentiate between a grief experience versus anxiety or depression that could end up being really, really difficult for someone? And can you help us differentiate those two things?
Absolutely. I'm glad that's a great question, Father Dave. So, and there actually tends to be some confusion about this. So yeah, I can differentiate it pretty easily. Grief involves feeling more, right? And there's a host, a range of feelings, all 32 flavors, all different colors that come along with grief. And none of them feel good, right? Grief isn't a pleasant experience, but it's a rich experience. And it's one that ends up, with a lot of expression of emotion, a lot of need to talk to folks. Grief, when it's being handled healthily, enhances connection. Depression doesn't. Depression is deadening. This is the thing that people tend to kind of go, I think, in the wrong direction with. Depression's not the feeling of sadness, because if you can't feel sad, then there's something going on there too. Depression is the sense of being deadened, that there's less feeling, that your feeling's more restricted. When you talk to folks, and there may be folks on the call this morning have had this experience, but when you talk to a lot of folks who've experienced major depression, they're very clear on differentiating that from feelings of sadness, that the feeling of major depression is like being squashed. And my experience of grief, the times when I've lost folks and I've had experiences that have involved grief, doesn't feel like being squashed. It feels like being opened up so that you feel more vulnerable. You feel like there's things hurting you that wouldn't hurt you ordinarily. Depression makes you feel dead. So I think those are ways to kind of differentiate. Are you mourning what you've lost? Because that feels active. That feels like you have too much feeling. Depression feels like you're not feeling anything anymore. And anxiety feels like you're freaking out about what comes next. And again, very different than grief, right? So it's kind of like freaking out about what comes next is I don't want to get too far off on this topic. It's just it's been an interest of mine for a long time. So freaking out about what comes next is the biochemical response to perceived danger and novelty. And it's, literally there's a flood of adrenaline in your bloodstream. This is what you're doing. You're getting ready to fight or flee. And that's an adaptive response unless you've got absolutely no control. There's no way to flee. What are you going to do? There's no way to go. So that's the place where you've got to manage anxiety, treat depression, and experience grief. I'd say those are the ways to do it. I just came up with that, but it sounds pretty good.
Jay, that's so helpful. Thank you.
Hey, you're quite welcome, Father Dave.
All right, Jay, we've got two questions in the chat. The first one is, what advice do you have for helping us to address or reduce polarization in these challenging times?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And it's a tough one, right? Mm-hmm. So this is kind of coming...
We go for the big ones.
Yeah, you really do. All right, well, let me take a shot at this. I'm just going to take this from the perspective of racial polarization, because I think that tends to be sort of some of the underlying piece of it. One of the things that's been impressed upon me by folks who I've talked to, who are, sort of right in the thick of this, is that the main way through it for us as a society is for folks who are, I'm just going to swing for the bleachers on this one. So here it is for folks who are privileged within the current social structure to shut up and listen. Like, that's kind of the main thing, is shut up and listen, because you've had the privilege to, and I'm speaking here as a white straight male. So, right. So my job in a lot of this is to shut up and listen, because my voice has been privileged to define experience for hundreds of years. So my job is to shut up and listen to people who haven't been so privileged. I think if I expand that to the current political polarization, I would actually stick with that, is that if you are in a position of gender or racial or sexual orientation or economic, and that's a very important one, if you're in a position of privilege, to shut up and listen. And if you are moved to cross that divide and become an ally of some of the folks who are having those discussions, then shut up and listen to what you're being told in terms of how to be an ally. I think that's the best I can do. I don't think that, first of all, I don't think that, sort of all-out warfare helps anybody. And we see this in our political arena, and we see it all over the place, right? Where, people are just ready to go to the mats on things. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably not going to be constructive for the world. And here's why. I was trying to figure out how I could speak to this, not just sort of as a citizen, but as a shrink. So so from a shrink perspective, right, there is this thing called projective identification. And projective identification basically means that you take parts of your experience, your personality, and you project them onto people around you. It's actually kind of the way therapy works. But when it's applied to groups, that's when bad stuff happens. That's when people start applying parts of their own experience or fears that they have, or pieces of, their own anxieties, and they project them onto groups around them and then treat those groups as if they were the embodiments of their fear or their hatred or whatever. And the entire point, like literally from a psychodynamic perspective, the entire point of therapy is to get past that with people in your life, to get past that people in general. So you're treating people more like who they are. So you're, emotionally shutting up and listening to them rather than saying, oh, well, I know what you're like. So that's kind of the best that I can do. Is I think there needs to be more listening and less projective identification, but I also want to kind of underline that with folks who are in positions of privilege where your voices have generally been heard, and our voices, for people like me whose voices have traditionally been heard, it's incumbent upon us to really shut up and listen to what's going on.
And the emphasis on listening, not, as you said, trying to figure out what the representation is of a larger group, but actively listening for deeper understanding, that
Right.
insight and growth, and listening in that way.
Right.
Thank you.
You're
Jay,
welcome.
I think what we could do at Sunday worship services before the scripture readings, with the clergy could just say, all right, everyone, just shut up and listen.
I think that's
Isn't that what Jesus says? With anybody with ears, let them hear. It's just his King James version.
Yeah, it's kind of the nice way of saying that. I think that's excellent advice, Father Dave.
Oh, well done. Thank you for that. As we navigate families, neighbors, our communities, we are well aware that we are not always in agreement, and listening deeply to the underlying fear or anxiety and misconceptions that I'm guilty of it all the time, of listening, but thinking I know the end of your sentence and you haven't finished it yet.
Right.
The next question in the chat is shifting gears a little bit. Can you speak to balancing activity risk based on current knowledge and the need to leave home and interact, particularly for children and youth who need socialization but are less reliable in complying with social distancing? The experience of you're going out in public and doing your own precautions, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a space where there are no precautions being taken. And what's the balance? How do we navigate those waters?
Nobody shies away from the hard questions around here, do they?
They've had their coffee this morning. It's coffee talk.
Apparently so. So let me take a shot at that. Especially when it comes to kids, this is one of those spaces where there are zero right answers. And I've watched this, and it's, part of the world in my job is that I get to talk to people from every end of the political spectrum, and not just, among my clients, but among folks who are our funders and elected representatives. And so I know folks from far right to far left, and there's an interest, and it's not just an interest, it's a thirst in finding the right answer to this question, right? Because with the discussions about schools opening up and how are you going to do that safely, and summer camps, et cetera, my conclusion, again, wearing my shrink hat on this, is that I don't think there's a right answer to this. And here's why I don't think there's a right answer. Because I can't tell you that the experience of virtual school or isolation in the home is as positive for kids in terms of socialization and connection as being with them live. I can't tell you because it's not true, right? There's the experience of being with other kids and being in groups and being in self-motivated groups. So, play groups and kids on the playground and, kind of making the determination. That's how kids learn to be human. That really is how kids learn to be human. There's, oh my God, generations of research evidence that show that in the absence of that kind of interaction, there's challenges in terms of appropriate social, engagement. At the same time, if we were to say, yeah, you know what, that's right, it's worth the risk. We're going to put kids back in schools and off you go to the races. We're going to let kids hang out together and off you go to the races. There's a couple of caveats to that I think people need to think about, even beyond the issue of transmission of COVID. And that's that there's not that many circumstances, or kind of shouldn't be, especially for younger children, where they're unsupervised. Like, even if they're in a play group, there's generally an adult there somewhere on the playground, certainly in schools. There's the whole point of children's interaction and children's social interaction is not to recreate Lord of the Flies, right? It's to create a safe space where kids can have that interaction, but nobody can go too far. And as anybody who has kids, or anybody who's taught kids, or anybody who's treated kids can tell you, kids will go too far in the absence of, kids do not have a natural monitoring device that say, oh gosh, that's like too mean, I can't do that. That's what we instill in them. So there's going to be some kind of adult supervision around these groups. There has to be some kind of adult social containment. Well, once you go to that, you're in a place where you have adults who are vividly aware of the dangers of transmission. You have adults who are vividly aware, or should be, of the dangers of the pandemic spreading through asymptomatic contact through kids. Now, it seems to be less with younger kids, but again, the jury's so much still out on the science behind this, and that's not the course of like low risk. So that's not a great answer either, because you're talking about being around adults who are going to have their own levels of anxiety, and kids pick up on that, right? If you have a kid, you guys all know this, right? If you have a kid who's around, or a set of kids who are around adults who feel like, you know what, this isn't that safe. This is not a safe space. There's things going on here that are dangerous. Most kids pick that up, and they can do a couple of different things with it, right? They can say, oh, this isn't safe. The adult can't manage what's happening here, so now I'm scared, and now I'm going to kind of step back and withdraw from what's happening. Or they can say, haha, the adult is scared, I'm running the world, and I'm going to go cough in their face. There's all kinds of reactions that kids can have to adults radiating that sense of anxiety and not being, being able to manage what's going to happen. So I know that's kind of a waffling answer, but it's almost the best one I have, that there are no good choices about how you raise a kid during COVID. And I think one of the challenges, and one of the things, and I've watched it again across people I know on both sides of the political spectrum, one of the huge challenges in this discussion has been this thirst for the right answer. And that tends to be kind of determined by where you fall on the political spectrum. But when you kind of try and look at it objectively, it's like, nothing is great here. But, I can move up the timeline and give you an example of this too. One of the things that teenagers do in order to learn how to be young adults is they go to parties together. They figure out how to negotiate affection. They figure out how to negotiate challenge. They figure out how to negotiate affiliation. And they can't do that if they're entirely separated from each other. On the other hand, when you look at what's happening in places like Miami right now, and I was actually having a discussion with someone very much on the sort of far right end of the spectrum a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, yeah, what you're seeing across the state now, a lot of that spread has to do with late adolescents, kids in their 20s, who are generally asymptomatic, and they're socializing the way that kids should, but they're also spiking our numbers through the roof. There's no good answers to that. This is not a time when, again, it kind of goes back to the denial piece, right? This isn't a time when you can say, oh, you got to let kids be kids. Yeah, well, in a pandemic, do you really? And will that have an impact on their development? It absolutely will. But that's the time that we're kind of living in. So, that, like I said, it's kind of a waffly answer, but it's the best one I've got.
Well, and it's a complex situation, as you said. We have very few who lived through the Spanish flu who are still around
Right.
to tell us how that looked, and it was so very different then too. The isolation that occurred,
Right.
and you could see the effects in those later generations.
Right.
Thank you. We have given you no softballs today.
That's okay. I wouldn't know what to do with them.
Lots of fast, curvy ones, and I'm thankful for all of your answers along with your presentation today.
You're welcome.
It's a gift to have you here this morning. Are there any other questions that folks would like to ask? It's been delightful to have your insights and your knowledge and your affirmation of, yeah, this is where we are, as you said. We've said recently, if change is the only constant, and how we address that change, how we cope with that change is important, recognizing. I have a friend who showed up at a staff meeting. It wasn't our staff meeting, it was another one, but he decided it's his weekly shirt and it says, Lord have mercy. Because that's become his mantra. Some need more mercy each day and different moments of the day. But that is our bedrock of faith, of mercy and grace, and being able to take a deep breath and be in community, listening to those nudges of, I wonder how so-and-so is because they haven't been engaged, or at least with me, and checking in on others intentionally. If that's creating a weekly check-in so everybody can assess their roller coasters weekly, to, as you mentioned, the opportunity to gather with families weekly or monthly by Zoom to get that grasp of a larger space and where people are struggling, and outside of our four walls, that real gift. And the gift of our faith, being mercy and grace, are part of what we believe in, and that we are not alone in this time. And we are called to seek out God and one another as community, to build the beloved community, in the words of Dr. King and Howard Thurman, and our own tradition. Thank you. As Father Dave said, oh, Dennis, are you raising your hand with a question, or are you waving?
Well, both.
Okay.
I just had a question or a comment for everybody. These discussions, these classes that we've been having have really come through a lot of discussion with the Adult Education Commission. And I'm a vestry member, and Jim Messer is, and Abby's also, and very deeply involved with that. I was just going to say in this time that if there are topics that you would like to have discussed in the future, if you want to send an email to either of the three of us or all of us, we'd love to hear your ideas. Really, I've been so thankful that we've had such wonderful speakers like Jay today, and
Thank you.
And others who have been talking about what we think are really relevant and important topics for our time. But if you have some ideas, some gaps that you'd like us to fill, please feel free to connect with us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. We are so grateful for our vestry liaisons, Dennis and Jim Messer, and then our commission. And we are in the phase of the commission meets once a month to plan 2 months out. We usually do it by semester, but we have adapted and accepted this reality of, let's not do that too far along. Let's do one step at a time. So we're delighted, Jay, that you were here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
I was honored to be here.
All that you do daily, and for being available this morning. We appreciate and pray for you also. So thank you all. A reminder that this Wednesday we will not have a Wednesday evening service offering, but we will resume that the first Wednesday in August. And we will meet again next week as we have an official welcome to Wallace Marsh, our newest associate full-time on the leadership staff. Yes, we're all clapping about that. He'll be doing his "Who am I? Why am I here?" conversation, and we look forward to telling the rest of his story. Jay, thank you again.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Y'all
As always.
Y'all have a great afternoon. Happy Sunday.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Yay. Look at all those affirmations, Jay, in your chat.
I tell you, it's very nice. It's humbling. It's wonderful, actually. That's why I always love doing this.
It's a shift from other things going on, I know.
A little bit. A very welcome one.
Yes. Well, again, well done. And while you might be preaching to the choir can it's always good to continue the casting of the net and empowering with knowledge. Yeah.
Well, anytime at all. You know where I am. So anytime I can help, just feel free to call.
Thank you. All right, Claire, shut us down.